Hello and welcome to my lecture review using the JBL book, Risk Management Fundamentals. This book is written by Gibson and Igonor. It's again, Managing Risk in Information Systems, 3rd edition. It is a Jones and Bartlett book, ISBN number 9781284183719. Again, they own all the copyrights. All I am doing is preparing lecture review for the PowerPoints that they own the rights to. So with that said, let's jump in and let's see what we can do. Chapter 3, Understanding and Maintaining Compliance. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at identifying the compliance laws, standards, protocols, guidelines, best practices, policies of risk management, and all of those things gearing towards the concept of compliance verification. Compliance laws that affect IT-based systems are going to be one of the key concepts. We're also going to be looking at regulations related to compliance, policies for compliance, and standard and guidelines for compliance. If you've not realized yet, we are focusing on compliance in this chapter, looking at the different numerous U.S. laws dealing with different major industries. We have COPA, starting from the bottom, Child Online Privacy Protection Act. We have CIPA, Children's Internet Protection Act. FERPA, that's going to be educational records, SOX, publicly traded companies, GLBA, we have HIPAA, and FSMA. In reality, most people, if you go to school, you're going to know something more about FERPA. If you're going to a medical facility, it's going to be HIPAA. If you have kids in school, it's going to be CIPA and COPA. If you're dealing with traded organizations, you're going to deal with SOX. So each of these deal with very specific areas. So it's not just one industry. These all have niche industries. So things like FSMA that deals with federal agencies. HIPAA, anything dealing with medical. GLBA is banks, brokerage companies, and insurance companies. SOX, any publicly traded organizations. FERPA, education. CIPA, schools and libraries. And COPA are websites or online services, anything targeting children younger than 13. So there are structured guidelines for these. It's not just willy-nilly. It really is based off of your organizational, your sector, your industry, dictates what compliances you have to follow. So some of them, such as like HIPAA, do have a process. So again, HIPAA covers any organizational dealing with health data. So part of that process is a assessment, risk analysis, plan creation, plan implementation, and continual monitoring, and they keep running through this cycle. Let me grab my pen. And what's really funny is normally we start with an assessment, and we go through the 5 phases and we keep going through them because it's an always improving. HIPAA is one that most medical facilities know they have to do, and even then it's still a struggle to get them to actually do it. GLBA, this is for Financial Service Modernization Act. This deals with banking and insurance companies, and there are financial privacy rules and safeguard rules. And these rules basically dictate how companies have to notify customers about any privacy practices. SOX is about any publicly traded organization. After Enron, there were enforced stricter guidelines on publicly traded companies to ensure that public had faith in these organizations. So that's how we got SOX. The CEOs and CFOs are able to verify the accuracy of financial statements and prove the statements are accurate, and they are held accountable to a certain degree. FERPA deals with education records of student records, and that applies to schools that receive any funding from the Department of Education, state, local, colleges, high schools, all of that. SIPA is about Internet Protection Act for kids, designed to limit access to offensive content from schools and public libraries. I had to fight this on a regular basis, working with certain schools at K through 12 type programs. They never wanted to actually comply with SIPA protection, and we numerous times had, again, pre-K, using a computer, would type in certain things on a search, and there was no filtering, so they got content they shouldn't have been allowed to get. And again, SIPA does apply to school and libraries that receive funding for the E-rate program. And verification of SIPA is not always as stringent as it should be. It does require schools and libraries to block or filter internet access to pictures that are obscene or harmful to minors, but again, verification of this isn't always there. We also have COPA, designed to protect the privacy of children younger than 13, basically sites that require parental consent to collect PII, and the sites must post their privacy policies and how to seek verified content from parent or guardians. Again, seek verifiable consent. Big thing there is, if you do say that you are younger than 13, how is the system allowing you to continue? And part of that, again, is verifying that that actually does happen. Regulations, as it relates to compliance, oftentimes is not always. HIPAA is done through HHS, but there are several of them that relate back to the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. That community group does fall under the Security and Exchange Commission, which from there we have the Bureau of Consumer Protection, Bureau of Competition, and Bureau of Economics. Again, these are all agencies that report to the FTC, which reports to the SEC, specifically in relation to how the regulations relate to compliance. Oftentimes, people don't view the regulations as part of compliance or part of verification, but they are. Other regulatory agencies, FDIC, if you're dealing with banks, that will be the insurance corporation. We have DHS, we have the attorney generals, and we have the state's attorney generals. The AGs are the attorney generals of either the U.S. or region or state AGs. All of these agencies directly hit compliance requirements. And these are not the only ones. This is just a high-level overview, but they exist. So we need to understand how our compliance, based off of our sector, does actually involve or connect with these different agencies. All right, so why does this matter? In reality, especially if you're an executive, organizational policies for compliance typically have some duties. One of the biggest duties is a fiduciary duty, which refers to the relationship of trust. Could be a person who is trusted to hold someone else's assets and make decisions according to what would be best for the individual, not the person holding it. So, for example, I sit on a board for a nonprofit. I have a fiduciary responsibility to the nonprofit, meaning I have to put the nonprofit first. So if I'm looking at a decision that might make me money or might be better for the nonprofit, I have a responsibility, a fiduciary duty to hold the nonprofit in a little bit higher regard. Again, that's the relationship of trust. Trusted person has the responsibility to act in the best interests of the entity you're holding that trust, and typically to avoid conflicts of interest when feasible. or at least to disclose them and follow the operational procedures of the organization to the best of your ability. We also have examples. So an attorney-client privilege, CEO and board of directors, shareholders and board of directors. We also have a few expected extra steps, due diligence and due care. So sometimes organizations implement options to kind of help actually go through this process. So it could be as simple as mandatory vacation day. And people might go, well, why is that a big issue? Well, I've actually worked with organizations where they had someone in a financial area. They each day were padding the numbers so that no one realized that they were skimming off the top. And when they were required to take 2 weeks vacation, no access at all, well, it was all uncovered. And this person was eventually terminated because their ability to hide what was going on was removed with the mandatory vacation. You can also verify work things by doing job rotation, separation of duties. Even on the companies that I own, I try to separate my duties while I own the organization. I might have one person sign, one person balance the checkbook. That way, there's 2 separate people to do things. That'd be separation of duties. Lastly is acceptable use. What are you allowed to do with assets? What are you allowed to do with these company or organizational resources? There should be something that dictates what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. So, other standards might be an industry standard like PCI DSS, payment card industry. We might have federal compliance guidelines like NIST. We also have the Generally Accepted Information Security Principles. We also have COBIT. COBIT is very common in SOX. We also have an international set of standards as well. So there are standard and guidelines for compliances. You just have to know which sector you're in so you know how to follow the guidelines for your sector or industry. These are not all of them. We also have things like the International Electrochemical Commission. We have the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. These are more guidelines. GDPR is more EU compliance. That's not a guideline. That's a straight compliance. We also have the Department of Defense Information Assurance Certification and Accreditation process. Again, that's more of a guideline. Capabilities, maturity, model integration. Those are more like guidelines. So some of these are guidelines, some of these are standards, some of these are still compliances for other more international groups. So let's say that you take a payment card. We already said PCI DSS. But these are big compliances. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, we don't have to worry about it. If your organization takes debit or credit cards, you have to meet the industry recognized approval, and that will be PCI DSS. Basically, this was created by the Credit Card Industry Security Standard Council, and it applies if you take cards, essentially. American Express, MasterCard, Visa, JCB, again, all the big major card providers. And they're looking at key pieces of information. They're looking at name, credit card number, expiration, and security code. And again, this is an industry regulation. What is interesting is I've dealt with many organizations that would write down the name and credit card number on a piece of paper. Well, that's actually a violation of this compliance. I've had large organizations do the exact same thing, and I've called them out. I do a lot of PCI DSS audit checking, so this is one of the more common compliances where I'm located. Basically, if you're a merchant and you're taking cards, you're meeting this. And if you're not, then you're typically going to be working with fines. So, what are the goals? Basically, build and maintain a secure network that's PCI compliant, including vulnerability checking, protect cardholder data, maintain a vulnerability management program, make sure you have the appropriate controls, regularly monitor and test your networks, and maintain a security policy. What's interesting is these are not hard goals, and they're flexible enough so that you can implement them however you want. It's just organizations have to implement them. And that's where organizations fail. Basically, they have to assess, report, remediate, and circle again. This is a never-ending process. For a lot of my clients, we do regular, every 6 months assessments. We do a vulnerability scan and we remediate. And that way we have all of it documented. That way, if there's any issues, we have a process and we can show the documentation. And understand this is an ongoing process. It's not one and done. That's my favorite. Organizations love to do one and done and that's it. And that's not how this works. So we also have other guidelines like NIST, and they promote innovation, competitiveness, and they make sure that they have straight guidelines so that organizations know how to best implement security controls. We also have things like the generally acceptable information security principles. And again, these are more pervasive principles and broad functional principles so that you at least have something to start off with. Bare minimum, not necessarily the end-all be-all, but they're a starting point. Control objectives for COBIT, again, this is going to be more focused on meeting SOX, but it's meeting stakeholder needs, covering the enterprise end-to-end, documentation, actually applying a integrated framework for reporting, looking at more of a holistic approach to the entire process, and separate governance from management so that there is a clear separation to ensure that there is no fraud going on or bearing of funds. Again, COBIT normally in relation to SOX. So everything is built around these policies and procedures, and this drives the organization. What's interesting with this, let me grab my pen, is literally policies and procedures are center for everything. Everything, infrastructure goes back and forth. Behavior of the organization, the structure of the organization, all the processes, everything is built around policies and procedures. Then we have our ISO standards. ISO, well, in reality, we have ISO 27000, and that actually consists of 27001 and 2, and those are the security techniques and controls. We have things like ISO 31000, that's the principles and guidelines for implementation. Then we have our ISO 73, which is risk management, focusing on vocabulary. So it's one of those things that we have them, and oftentimes ISO 2700 standards, these are big companies that are tackling this. Normally not small companies are going to be looking at implementing the controls for 27,000. And again, we have other groups like the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC. They meet the requirements for more of a global market, ensure maximum use of its standards, aid in interoperability of systems and processes, aid in improvement for human health and safety, things like that. ITIL, that's going to be more of a life cycle for MSPs and support companies. It's service, strategy, design, transition, operations. So again, there's a lot of different guidelines and models here to aid in your development. One challenge is, well, which one do I use? And again, that's not as simple as answering just yes or no. We have our maturity model integration, and again, we rank and prioritize so that we can better quantify them. GDPR is a European standard for the right to be forgotten for EU citizens. So I'm not even sure why this is in the structured area. Like, this would have been in the compliance area at the very beginning, dealing with like HIPAA and FERPA. GDPR is a set of regulations. We also have the Department of Defense Information Assurance Certification or Accreditation process. Again, this is just dealing with accreditation. So again, this is just a brief overview of compliances, their kind of understanding that they exist and that they're not, these standalone giant creatures. They take some work, but there's a lot of them, and there are typically processes involved in making sure that they're easily to be followed and maintained. Easily, I mean, that's very subjective, but normally someone should be able to follow them and implement them throughout common organizations. So, all right, and that takes us to the end of this chapter. So, questions, thoughts, issues, or concerns, please feel free to reach out. Thank you. Alrighty, well, thank you. That concludes this lecture review. Again, all material presented in this PowerPoint lecture was copyrighted by Jones and Bartlett Learning. So they own the copyright. I am just providing a lecture on the PowerPoints that they provided. With that said, if you have any questions, thoughts, issues, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me, leave a comment, get in touch with me, and I will get those addressed as quickly as I can. Thank you.